A boy slipped into the Vampire King's private sanctuary during the Midnight Council, a place where even nobles feared to tread uninvited. But there he stood, 8 years old, with eyes too curious for his own safety, watching Lord Lavinia Fiorentino trace battle strategies with pale fingers. And then the child saw it. The crimson crest glowing faintly on the king's wrist beneath his rolled sleeve, an ancient mark that hadn't appeared outside the royal bloodline in 2 centuries. The boy's voice, small and innocent in the heavy silence, shattered 20 years of buried secrets. "Sir, my dad has a mark just like yours." The quill fell from Lavinia's hand. The candles flickered, and in that breath between heartbeats, every lie that built the Fiorentino dynasty began to crack. The Merkelfield citadel stood like a crown of obsidian and silver against the perpetual twilight. Lord Lavinia Fiorentino's private study occupied the highest tower, a circular chamber where strategy was carved from shadow and candlelight, where the fate of kingdoms was decided by a single immortal hand. It was here, surrounded by ancient texts and maps marked with blood-red ink, that the Vampire King conducted his most secret councils. And it was here that 8-year-old Caden Yang should never, ever have been. But Caden had inherited his father's talent for slipping through shadows unnoticed. The son of the head butler learned early that invisibility was survival in a court of immortals. Tonight, curiosity had pulled him from his small bed in the servants' wing, through corridors lit by floating blue flames, up spiral stairs that seemed to climb forever, until he reached the heavy oak door left slightly ajar. The boy had only meant to peek. He hadn't meant to witness the moment that would unravel everything. Caden had never seen Lord Lavinia move so fast. One moment, the Vampire King stood in his study. The next, he was striding through the corridors with a predator's grace, his crimson robes billowing like wings. The boy had to run to keep pace, his small feet echoing against stone floors that suddenly felt too cold, too empty. "Sir, did I do something wrong?" Caden asked breathlessly, but Lavinia didn't answer. His jaw was set like carved marble, his eyes fixed ahead with an intensity that made the floating candles dim as they passed. The servant corridors wound downward, growing narrower, darker. This was Caden's world, the hidden passages where people like him kept the castle running while remaining invisible to those who mattered. But with the Vampire King beside him, everything felt different, smaller, more fragile. 20 years ago, these same corridors had echoed with different screams. "No! Father, please!" A 12-year-old boy with dark hair and desperate eyes fought against armored hands dragging him backward. His parents were already in chains, his mother weeping, his father's face bloodied but defiant. "We didn't do anything. We're innocent." Counselor Mason Clark stood at the top of the grand staircase, his smile cold beneath the torchlight. "Treason is not forgiven, young prince. Your family chose gold over loyalty. Now you'll all pay the price." "You're lying!" Young Peregrine's voice cracked. "You're lying!" But no one listened. The castle gates opened like a mouth to swallow his world whole. His parents were led to the execution grounds. He was thrown into the mud beyond the borders with nothing. No name, no family, no future. Just a glowing mark on his wrist that would haunt him forever. "This is it," Caden said, stopping before a plain wooden door. His hand trembled slightly as he knocked. "Papa, are you still awake?" Inside, Peregrine Yang stood surrounded by tomorrow's duties, linens to be pressed, silver to be polished, schedules to be organized. He was 32 now, though the years of hiding had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His dark hair was tied back, his servant's uniform immaculate. He'd perfected the art of being nobody. He looked up as the door opened and saw death standing in the doorway. The color drained from Peregrine's face like water from a shattered glass. His breath caught. His hand moved instinctively to his left wrist, clutching it as though he could hide what had already been revealed. Lord Lavinia stepped inside, his presence filling the small room like smoke. 20 years, he said softly, dangerously. 20 years, and you were here the entire time. Your Majesty, Peregrine's voice died in his throat. Show me your arm. Silence stretched between them, heavy as a blade poised to fall. Caden looked between his father and the king, confusion twisting in his chest. Papa, what's happening? Peregrine's eyes met his son's for one heartbreaking moment. Then, slowly, because there was no escape left, no more running, he extended his arm and rolled back his sleeve. The crimson crest blazed on his wrist like a brand, identical to Lavinia's, undeniable and damning. The mark pulsed with ancient magic, recognizing its twin, calling out across 2 decades of silence. Papa, why do you look scared? Caden whispered. But his father couldn't answer. Terror had stolen his voice. Lavinia raised one hand. Guards flooded into the room from nowhere and everywhere, silent, efficient, deadly. They surrounded Peregrine like wolves circling wounded prey. Peregrine Fiorentino, Lavinia's voice was winter itself. I thought you died with your parents in exile. Peregrine's shoulders sagged, 20 years of fear finally breaking through. So did I, Your Majesty. He breathed, and the words sounded like a confession and a prayer. Every single day since they threw me out, I've been dead. But the Vampire King showed no mercy. His eyes held something worse than anger. Calculation, suspicion, the cold assessment of a ruler who'd been deceived. Seize him, he commanded. Lock him in the tower until I decide what to do with a ghost who wears the crest. Armored hands closed around Peregrine's arms. Caden screamed, lunging forward, but someone caught him, held him back as his father was dragged toward the door. Papa! Papa, no! Peregrine looked back once, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Caden. I'm so sorry. And then he was gone, swallowed by guards and shadows, leaving his son alone with a king who now knew too much and a secret that could never be buried again. The laundry chambers were thick with steam when the guards arrived. River Butler had her arms elbow deep in scalding water, scrubbing Noble's linens until her hands were raw. It was past midnight, but sleep was a luxury servants couldn't afford. Not when tomorrow's banquet required perfection. The door slammed open. 4 guards in Fiorentino crimson filled the doorway, their armor catching the lamplight like blood. River Butler, the captain's voice cut through the humid air. You're summoned, now. Her heart stopped. The wet sheet fell from her hands. What? Why? What's happened? Is it Caden? Panic clawed up her throat. Is my son hurt? Come with us. They didn't answer questions. They never did. River's mind raced through terrible possibilities as they marched her through corridors she'd never walked before. The ones meant for nobles, not maids. Her damp dress clung to her legs. Her hands still smelled of lye soap. The council chamber doors opened like a mouth. And there, in the center of that cavernous room, chained between 2 guards with his head bowed and his servant's uniform torn, was her husband. Peregrine! River lunged forward, but armored hands caught her shoulders, holding her back. What did you do to him? Lord Lavinia Fiorentino sat on a raised dais, watching her with those ancient crimson eyes that missed nothing. Beside him stood a woman in scholar's robes. Counselor Angel Dunlap, River realized, though she'd only ever seen her from a distance. Please, River's voice broke. Whatever he did, I'll take his punishment. Just spare our son. He's only 8. You didn't know, did you? Lavinia's voice was quieter than she'd expected, almost gentle, almost cruel in its gentleness. You didn't know you married a prince. The words made no sense. River stared at him, then at Peregrine, whose shoulders had begun to shake. What are you talking about? Peregrine's a butler. Show her, Lavinia commanded. A guard yanked Peregrine's sleeve up roughly. The crimson crest blazed on his wrist like a fresh wound. River's world tilted sideways. 10 years ago, in a border town where no one asked questions and everyone kept secrets, a broken man had stumbled into the inn's stables. Peregrine Yang, he'd called himself. 22 years old with haunted eyes and hands that shook when he thought no one was watching. He'd begged for work, any work. He'd sleep in the hay. He wouldn't be trouble. River had been 20, running from a father who drank and a village that judged. She'd taken the maid position at the same inn 3 days before he'd arrived. 2 damaged souls, keeping their heads down, surviving. She'd noticed him because he never met anyone's eyes. Because he startled at loud noises. Because sometimes, late at night, she'd heard him crying in the stables. Their first real conversation happened over spilled grain. She'd been carrying a sack too heavy for her frame. It burst. He'd helped her clean it up without being asked. You don't have to do this, she'd said. I know, he'd replied. But neither do you. Something shifted between them in that moment. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that comes when one broken thing sees another. Months passed. Conversations became longer. He'd smile sometimes, rare and precious as sunlight through storm clouds. She'd learned he loved poetry, but couldn't remember where he'd learned to read. That he had nightmares he never explained. That he flinched when people got too close. One night, she'd found him staring at his wrist, at a mark that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. What is that? She'd asked. He'd covered it quickly. A scar, from childhood. She'd wanted to ask more, had sensed there was more. But they were both running from something, weren't they? So she'd let it go. Their wedding was witnessed by a traveling priest who asked no questions and a newborn son who slept through the vows. No family, no celebration. Just 2 people promising to protect each other from whatever shadows they'd escaped. You never trusted me with the truth? River's voice shattered the memory. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the stranger in chains who wore her husband's face. Peregrine finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and devastated. I trusted you with my life, River. Every single day, I trusted you with my life. Then why? I couldn't trust you with my death. His voice cracked. If you knew what I was, who I was, they'd kill you for it. They'd kill Caden. I thought if I stayed silent, if I buried it deep enough, you'd be safe. That he'd be safe. Safe? River laughed bitterly. Look where we are, Peregrine. Look where your silence brought us. Lavinia rose from his seat, his presence filling the chamber like winter descending. Counselor Dunlap, he said, without taking his eyes off Peregrine. I want every record from the banishment 20 years ago. Trial transcripts, evidence, witness statements, everything. Angel bowed. Your Majesty, the archives. I don't care if you have to dig through dust and ash. His voice was steel. If Peregrine Fiorentino was framed, I need to know. He paused, letting silence stretch like a noose. If he wasn't, he hangs at dawn. River's knees buckled. Guards held her upright as Peregrine's head dropped forward, chains rattling. And in that council chamber, surrounded by stone and shadow and secrets that refused to stay buried, a family built on necessary lies began to crumble. The vault of forgotten records existed 3 levels below the Merkelfield Citadel's foundations, where even the air tasted of age and secrets. Angel Dunlap descended the spiral staircase with a torch in one hand and righteous fury in her heart. Behind her, royal historian Octavia Capet moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that truth, once disturbed, could cut like broken glass. 20 years, Angel muttered, her breath misting in the cold. These records haven't been touched in 20 years, because no one wanted to remember. Octavia's voice echoed off stone walls carved with warnings in dead languages. Treason trials are meant to be cautionary tales, not investigated. The vault door required 3 keys and a blood seal. It groaned open like a throat releasing a final confession. Inside, shelves stretched into shadow, packed with scrolls and ledgers bound in chains. The trial records sat in a locked iron box marked with the Fiorentino crest, a crown wrapped in thorns, now wrapped in dust. Angel broke the seal. Parchment crackled as she unrolled the transcripts, and there it was, the accusation that had destroyed a family. Prince Peregrine's parents, Lord Vincenzo and Lady Tessa Fiorentino, stand accused of high treason. Evidence presented by Councillor Mason Clark includes correspondence with enemy kingdoms, written in Lord Vincenzo's own hand, detailing strategic weaknesses of our defenses. Additionally, gold coins bearing enemy mint marks were discovered in their private chambers, payment for betrayal. Damning, Angel breathed. But Octavia was already examining the attached letters with a magnifying lens, her scholarly instincts prickling. She held one up to the torchlight, squinting at the elegant script. The handwriting. What about it? It's too perfect. Octavia's finger traced the loops and curves. No one writes this consistently. Even trained scribes have variants, pressure changes, ink flow, fatigue. This looks like someone copied exemplar text letter by letter. Angel moved closer. Forged? Look here. Octavia pointed to a subtle repeated pattern. The same word formation, exact spacing. This wasn't written naturally. It was constructed. They turned to the gold coins next, spreading them across a dusty table. Octavia picked one up, examining the mint mark with growing horror. These coins, she said slowly, weren't minted until 3 years after the trial. The words hung in the cold air like smoke. The evidence was forged! Angel's voice shook with fury. Mason Clark framed them! They dug deeper. At the bottom of the box, beneath official seals and signed death warrants, they found a loose parchment in different handwriting. Hasty, secretive, never meant to be preserved. Clark disappeared 2 weeks after execution, presumed dead by ambush. Good riddance to paranoid fools. Captain Herrick. But folded inside that note was another, smaller slip. Just one line in elegant script that made Angel's blood run cold. The prince is a loose end. Find him. 3 floors above, in the tower's highest cell, Caden Yang sat cross-legged on cold stone across from his father. The boy had slipped past the guards with help from Lachlan Crivelli, a captain whose own father had served under Peregrine's parents, and who remembered when honor meant something. "Tell me," Caden whispered. "Tell me everything." Peregrine looked at his son, this child who'd destroyed his carefully constructed anonymity with 5 innocent words, and something inside him finally broke open. "I was 12 when they took everything," he began, his voice hollow. "Your grandparents were loyal to the crown. They would have died for this kingdom. Instead, they died because of it. But you escaped." "Escaped?" A bitter laugh. "They threw me beyond the gates like garbage. I spent 10 years running, hiding in border towns, taking any work that didn't require a name. I slept in stables. I stole food. I learned that survival meant becoming no one." Caden's young face crumpled with understanding beyond his years. "But you're a prince. Why didn't you come back and fight?" Peregrine reached through the bars, touching his son's cheek gently. "Because I was a child, Caden. And children don't win against monsters. They just learn to hide until the monsters forget they exist." "Did the monsters forget?" "I thought they had." Peregrine's hand fell away. "I was wrong." The cell door burst open. Angel Dunlap stood there, breathless, clutching parchments to her chest. "Where's Lord Lavinia?" "His chambers." She was already running. She found the Vampire King standing at his window, watching dawn approach like an executioner. "Your Majesty, have you found proof of his guilt?" Lavinia's voice was tired. "I've found proof of his innocence." Angel spread the documents across his desk with shaking hands. "The evidence was forged. The handwriting, the coins, all of it fabricated by Mason Clark." Lavinia's eyes widened, the first crack in his ancient composure. "There's more." Angel's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "Mason Clark didn't die 20 years ago. He disappeared, and before he did, he left orders." She pushed the final note toward him. "He's been hunting Peregrine this whole time." Lavinia read the words once, twice. Then his hand clenched into a fist, crumpling the parchment. "Mason Clark is still alive." "Yes, Your Majesty." The Vampire King's eyes blazed crimson in the growing light. "Then we have a traitor to hunt." The council chamber filled with whispers as Lord Lavinia Fiorentino stood before his assembled court. Peregrine was brought in without chains this time, though guards still flanked him on both sides. River and Caden watched from the gallery above, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles had gone white. 20 years ago, Lavinia's voice carried through the vaulted space like judgment itself. "A great injustice was committed within these walls. Prince Peregrine Fiorentino's family was accused of treason, a charge we now know to be fabricated by Councillor Mason Clark, who sought to steal their lands and position." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nobles exchanged shocked glances. Servants pressed against doorways to hear better. Peregrine Fiorentino was wrongly accused. "His family's honor is restored." Lavinia's crimson eyes swept the room, daring anyone to object. "Let it be recorded in all official documents. Let it be known throughout the kingdom." The court erupted in carefully measured applause, the kind that came from political necessity rather than genuine joy. But afterward, in the privacy of Lavinia's study, the Vampire King's tone was winter itself. "I believe you were framed," he said, pouring 2 glasses of wine he wouldn't drink. "I don't yet believe you're trustworthy." Peregrine stood by the window, still wearing the simple clothes of a servant because nothing else fit the man he'd become. "I don't want your throne. Everyone wants power. It's human nature." "Then it's fortunate I stopped being human 20 years ago." Peregrine turned, meeting those ancient eyes with 20 years of survival hardening his own. "I want my family safe. That's all I've ever wanted." "Then help me destroy Mason Clark," Lavinia said softly, dangerously. "Help me end the monster who created yours. Do that, and you'll have your safety." "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll question whose side you're truly on." The training yard rang with the clash of steel 3 days later. Peregrine moved through combat forms he hadn't practiced in 2 decades, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. He was rusty, slower than he'd been as a boy, but muscle memory was a stubborn thing. Lavinia watched from the balcony above, his calculating gaze never leaving the man who wore the crimson crest. Lachlan Crivelli stood beside him, arms crossed. "He's good," the captain observed. "Better than most nobles who've trained their whole lives." "He was taught by the best." Lavinia's fingers drummed against the stone railing. "The question is whether that makes him an ally or a threat." "You think he'll turn on you?" "I think a man who's lost everything once will do anything to keep it from happening again." Lavinia's voice was quiet. "Even if that means taking what isn't his." In the eastern wing, River stood before a mirror she didn't recognize, wearing silk she'd only ever laundered. Lady Yang, they called her now, as if a title could erase 28 years of scrubbing floors and keeping her head down. Angel Dunlap had helped her dress, patient with the complicated clasps and layers that nobility wore like armor. "You'll adjust," the counselor had said kindly. But River felt like a child playing dress-up in stolen clothes. That night, she told Peregrine as much. They stood in chambers 3 times larger than any space they'd ever shared, surrounded by luxury that felt like a beautiful cage. "I married a stable hand," River whispered, her back to him. "I don't know how to be a prince's wife." Peregrine crossed the room, turning her gently to face him. His calloused hands, still a servant's hands despite everything, cupped her face. "You already are. You always have been." "How can you say that? I didn't even know who you were." "You knew the parts that mattered, the parts I couldn't fake or hide." His thumb brushed away a tear. "You knew the man, River. The rest is just a name they took from me." In the library, Caden sat with Octavia Capet among towers of books, trying to understand a world that had shifted beneath his feet like quicksand. "If Papa is a prince?" the boy asked carefully. "Why isn't he king?" Octavia set down her quill, choosing her words with a scholar's precision. "Because Lord Lavinia is the rightful king. The throne passes through specific bloodlines, and your father—" She paused, seeing the confusion in those young eyes. "Your father has a different path." "What path?" But Octavia's eyes held uncertainty that even an 8-year-old could read. "That," she said softly, "is what we're all trying to figure out." The messenger arrived at sunset 3 days later, his horse lathered and dying. He collapsed in the courtyard, gasping out words that turned blood to ice. "Mason Clark's forces, spotted at the northern border. Thousands of them. Shadow creatures. Corrupted nobles, the undead." Lavinia caught him before he fell. "How long until they reach us?" The messenger's eyes rolled with terror. 3 days, Your Majesty. Maybe less." The vampire king looked up to where Peregrine stood on the training yard balcony, their eyes meeting across the distance. An unspoken question hung between them. Could two men who barely trusted each other survive what was coming? Would they even want to, once it was over? Maps covered the war table like scars, topographical lines, defensive positions, predicted attack vectors. Lavinia and Peregrine stood on opposite sides, moving markers with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that strategy was the difference between survival and slaughter. "He'll hit the eastern wall first," Peregrine said, his finger tracing the weakest fortification. "It's the obvious choice, which means he'll actually strike from the north while we're reinforcing the wrong position." Lavinia's eyes narrowed with something like respect. "You learned tactics from your father." "I learned survival from exile." Peregrine moved 3 markers to the northern ramparts. "Mason taught me to think like someone who has nothing to lose." Their synergy was undeniable. Peregrine understood infantry movements, supply lines, siege psychology. Lavinia knew defensive magic, vampire combat formations, how to weaponize darkness itself. Together, they built a strategy that might, just might, hold against impossible odds. But Angel Dunlap, watching from the corner, saw what they didn't. She saw the way Peregrine's gaze drifted to the throne when Lavinia turned to consult ancient texts, the way his hand tightened on a marker when discussing post-battle arrangements, the hunger that flickered behind carefully controlled expressions. Outside, the castle transformed into a fortress. Servants hauled stones. Mages carved protective runes into walls that had stood for centuries without needing them. Soldiers drilled until exhaustion became normalcy. Lachlan found Lavinia alone on the ramparts, watching workers reinforce the gates. "Sire, I must speak plainly." "You always do." "Are we certain we can trust Peregrine? What if this is all a ruse, Mason's final trick? What if he lets the enemy through our defenses?" Lavinia was silent for a long moment, his crimson eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "I trust his hatred of Mason Clark," he said finally. "That's enough. For now?" "For now." In the training yard, River faced down both men who thought they had the right to dictate her survival. "You want to evacuate me and Caden like furniture too precious to risk." "River, please." Peregrine began. "No." Her voice cut like a blade. "I'm not some helpless thing to be hidden away. I've survived 28 years without either of you deciding what's safe for me." "You survived because you were invisible," Peregrine said softly, desperately. "Now you're a target." "Mason will come for you to hurt me." "Then teach me to be a weapon instead of a victim." Lavinia stepped forward, surprising them both. "The lady has a point. Fear makes people hesitate. Training makes them dangerous." He looked at Peregrine with something almost like challenge. "Unless you'd prefer your wife helpless." The lesson began that afternoon. Caden found his father in the armory hours later, alone among weapons that gleamed like promises of death. The boy had overheard servants whispering about casualty projections, about what happened to castles that fell, about whether children would be spared. "Papa?" His small voice echoed in the metal-lined chamber. "Are you going to die?" Peregrine turned, and for a moment the mask slipped. He looked terrified. Then he knelt, pulling his son close. "Not if I can help it. But Caden, if something happens to me, I need you to promise something." "Promise what?" "Promise you'll take care of your mother. And promise." He hesitated, the words catching like thorns. "Promise you'll trust Lord Lavinia." Caden pulled back, studying his father's face with 8-year-old wisdom that saw too much. Why? Don't you trust him? Peregrine's silence stretched too long. Damning, absolute. The warning bells shattered the moment, 3 short rings that meant scouts returning with urgent news. They ran to the courtyard where a rider collapsed from his horse, blood streaming from a shoulder wound. "They're here," he gasped. "Mason's army, thousands. They've made camp at the ridge." Lavinia's voice was iron. "How long?" The scout's eyes held the terror of a man who'd seen hell approaching. "The siege begins at dawn." Dawn broke like a wound across the sky, crimson and violent. Mason Clark's army came with it. They poured over the ridge like a plague made flesh. Undead soldiers whose eyes glowed with stolen life. Shadow beasts that moved like liquid darkness given teeth and hunger. Corrupted vampire mercenaries who'd sold their loyalty for promises of power. Thousands. Tens of thousands. The outer walls held for exactly 3 hours. Stone exploded under magical assault. Gates that had stood for centuries buckled and screamed. Defenders fell from ramparts, their screams cut short by the tide of darkness below. By midday, Mason's forces had breached the courtyard. Lavinia fought like the ancient predator he was, all brutal efficiency and centuries of killing perfected into art. His blade moved too fast for mortal eyes to follow, carving through enemies that dissolved into ash and shadow. Magic crackled from his fingertips, incinerating whole clusters of undead soldiers. But even immortals could tire. Blood, his own, stained his crimson armor. His movements, while still deadly, had begun to slow. Peregrine fought nearby, and his style was different, rougher, born from desperation rather than training. He moved like a man protecting his home because that's exactly what he was. When Lachlan went down under 3 shadow beasts, Peregrine threw himself between them and the captain, his blade finding throats and hearts with the precision of someone who understood that hesitation meant death. Lachlan stared up at him, breathing hard. You saved my life. We're on the same side." Peregrine extended a bloodied hand. "Aren't we?" The captain took it. In the healing chambers, River had ignored every evacuation order. She moved among the wounded with the same efficiency she'd once used to scrub floors. Only now her hands pressed bandages to bleeding wounds, held broken soldiers steady while healers worked their magic, whispered comfort to men who'd never noticed her before. When the shadow beast crashed through the window, all claws and hunger and wrongness, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed a fallen soldier's spear and drove it through the creature's eye. Peregrine found her minutes later, covered in black ichor that steamed in the air. "I told you to leave!" River turned, her eyes blazing with something he'd never seen before. "And I told you I'm done being told what to do." The inner courtyard shook. A presence descended, ancient, powerful, wrong. Mason Clark stepped through a portal of shadow, his face preserved by decades of dark magic, his eyes burning with necromantic power that made reality itself recoil. "The boy who escaped." His voice was silk over steel as he spotted Peregrine. "Look at you, pretending to be a hero." Peregrine's grip tightened on his sword. "You stole my childhood, murdered my parents, framed my family for crimes they never committed." "Yes, I did." Mason's smile was a terrible thing. "And I'll do it again, starting with your son." Shadow creatures materialized around him, dragging something, someone, from behind the rubble. Caden. The boy had been trying to help carry water to soldiers, too young to understand that battlefields devour children whole. Mason's hand closed around Caden's throat, lifting him off the ground. A blade appeared in his other hand, pressed to the boy's neck. Choose, Peregrine. Your life for his, just like your father chose and failed. The courtyard fell silent except for Caden's choked breathing. Peregrine's sword clattered to the stones. Take me. Let him go. Papa, no! Caden gasped. But then Lavinia was there, moving through the frozen moment. His eyes met Peregrine's across the blood-soaked courtyard. No words, no planning, just recognition. They attacked as one. They moved like a storm given form. Peregrine's desperate fury and Lavinia's ancient precision, weaving together into something neither could achieve alone. Peregrine went low, his blade seeking tendons and arteries, while Lavinia struck high with magic that burned reality itself. Mason's shadow creatures tried to intervene, but they were fighting something they couldn't comprehend. Two men who'd both lost everything and refused to lose again. Mason blocked Peregrine's strike, twisted away from Lavinia's spell, but he was already losing ground. His eyes widened with something that might have been respect, or might have been fear. You think you can trust each other? He laughed, dark and bitter. You're both too hungry for power. You'll tear each other apart the moment I'm gone. Perhaps. Lavinia's blade caught moonlight as it carved through shadow. But I'm hungrier for justice. And I'm hungrier to watch you die. Peregrine's voice was ice and fury. Mason summoned more power, darkness coalescing around him like armor. His grip on Caden tightened, using the boy as a shield. You'll have to go through the child to reach me. But Caden hadn't spent 8 years as a servant's son without learning how to survive in a world that didn't notice him. River had taught him to be useful. Peregrine had taught him to be observant. Lavinia, in their brief training sessions, had taught him that size didn't matter. Timing did. The boy went limp, suddenly dead weight in Mason's grip. The necromancer's attention shifted for just a fraction of a second. Caden's hand shot out, grabbing the silver letter opener from Mason's own belt, the ornate thing he used to open correspondence, never imagining it could be a weapon. The blade drove into Mason's thigh. Mason screamed, his concentration shattering. Caden dropped and rolled, just as his father had taught him during their secret practice sessions in the servants' quarters years ago. The opening was all they needed. Peregrine and Lavinia struck together, perfectly synchronized, as if they'd fought side by side for centuries rather than days. Peregrine's blade punched through Mason's chest, finding the heart that dark magic had kept beating for decades longer than it should. Lavinia's magic followed, burning through the necromantic enchantments that held the traitor's body together, unraveling spells woven in blood and betrayal. Mason staggered backward, black blood pouring from his mouth. His eyes found Peregrine's, and even dying, he smiled. You think this changes anything? He coughed, choking on his own corruption. You're both Fiorentinos. One throne, 2 claimants. Another wet laugh. History always repeats, boy. Always. Not this time, Peregrine whispered, but Mason was already laughing as the light left his eyes. Laughing like a man who'd planted seeds that would grow long after his death. His body collapsed into ash and shadow that the wind scattered across the bloodied courtyard. Silence fell like a shroud. Mason's forces, bound to his will through dark magic and darker promises, simply stopped. Undead soldiers crumbled to dust. Shadow beasts dissipated like nightmares at dawn. The corrupted vampires fled into the wilderness, their master's death breaking whatever hold he'd had on them. Victory. But the courtyard told a different story. 200 dead, maybe more. Bodies covered in white sheets lined the walls like accusations. The outer fortifications were rubble. Smoke rose from a dozen fires that still burned. Survivors moved through the carnage with the hollow eyes of people who'd seen too much. And in the center of it all stood two men, both bearing the crimson crest, both covered in blood, both staring at each other across a silence heavy with unspoken questions. Lavinia lowered his sword first. "Your son saved us. He learned from the best." Peregrine's voice was carefully neutral. "From both of us, it seems." Caden ran to his father, and Peregrine caught him, holding him so tightly the boy gasped. River appeared moments later, and they collapsed together as a family in the ruins of someone else's war. But Lavinia saw the way Peregrine looked around the courtyard, at the soldiers who'd followed his tactical commands, at the castle walls he'd helped defend, at the throne room visible through the shattered gates. The crimson crest on Peregrine's wrist pulsed in the dying light. Lachlan stepped beside his king, his voice low. "Your Majesty, what happens now?" Lavinia's eyes never left Peregrine. "Now we find out whether we destroyed one threat only to create another." Mason's final words echoed in the silence like prophecy. One throne, two claimants. History always repeats. 3 weeks transformed ruins into restoration. The outer walls rose again, stronger than before. The dead were honored with monuments carved from the same stone Mason's forces had shattered. Life, stubborn and persistent, returned to the citadel's corridors. The great hall filled with nobles, soldiers, servants, everyone who'd survived, and everyone who needed to witness what came next. Sunlight streamed through newly installed stained glass, painting the assembled crowd in colors that looked almost like hope. Lord Lavinia Fiorentino stood before his throne, regal in midnight blue edged with silver. His voice carried through the cavernous space with the weight of absolute authority. 20 years ago, a great injustice was done within these walls. The Fiorentino family was betrayed, not by their own actions, but by the treachery of Counselor Mason Clark, who sought power through deception and murder. Silence held the room like a breath between heartbeats. Today, we correct that injustice. Peregrine was brought forward, and the transformation was staggering. No longer the invisible butler in servant's gray. He wore the crimson and silver of Fiorentino nobility, colors he'd been born to and stripped of before he understood what they meant. His dark hair was properly groomed. His bearing, after weeks of retraining, carried the ghost of royal authority he'd tried so hard to bury. "I restore to Prince Peregrine Fiorentino his title, his lands, and his family's honor," Lavinia declared. "Let it be recorded. Let it be remembered. Let it be law." The crowd erupted in applause, thunderous, seemingly genuine. But Octavia Capet, watching from her position near the archives, saw what others missed. She saw certain nobles exchanging glances weighted with calculation. Saw hands tighten on sword hilts that shouldn't need tightening during celebration. Saw the future fracturing into dangerous possibilities. River stood beside her husband, and the silk gown felt like beautiful chains. Lady River Fiorentino, they called her now. She wore sapphires that cost more than her entire village had been worth. Her hair had been arranged by ladies' maids who'd once ignored her existence. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Angel found her afterward, in a quiet corridor away from the celebration. "You look terrified." "I don't belong here." River's voice cracked. I'm a maid playing dress-up. One wrong fork at dinner, and everyone will remember what I really am. We all feel that way at first. Angel's smile was gentle, understanding. I was a border town scholar with ink-stained fingers when Lavinia made me a counselor. Lachlan was a common soldier. Octavia was a village teacher. Neither did any of us, once. She touched River's trembling hand. We learned. So will you. In the gardens, Caden dodged between hedges, trying to escape another tutor who kept calling him young prince, with a deference that made his skin crawl. These were people who'd walked past him a month ago as if he were furniture. Now they bowed. He found his mother near the fountain. Everything's different now. Is that good? River pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his dark hair. I don't know yet, sweetheart. That evening, Lavinia found Peregrine alone in the throne room. The newly restored prince stood before the obsidian seat, staring at it like a man confronting a ghost. You fought well, Lavinia said quietly. You've earned your place here. Peregrine didn't turn. I never wanted a place here. And now? The vampire king moved closer, his ancient eyes reading every micro-expression, every tell. Now that you have it. The pause stretched too long. When Peregrine finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Now I'm grateful for everything you've done for my family, for trusting me when you had every reason not to, for giving us safety we never thought we'd have. But even as he spoke the right words, his eyes drifted to the throne. Just for a second, just a flicker of something hungry and wounded and calculating. Lavinia saw it. The temperature in the room dropped by a degree. Your gratitude is noted, Lavinia said, his tone unreadable. I hope it's genuine. It is. Good. Lavinia turned to leave, then paused. Because gratitude and ambition can look very similar from a distance, but up close, the difference becomes stark. He left Peregrine alone with the throne and his thoughts. In the guard tower, Lachlan found his king staring out at the rebuilt kingdom. Your Majesty, I've been thinking. That's rarely a good sign. Perhaps we should increase security around the royal chambers. Post additional guards near your quarters. Rotate the watch more frequently. Lachlan's voice was carefully neutral. Just as a precaution. Lavinia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Against what threat? Captain? The one we might have created when we gave an exiled prince back his power. Below them, in the throne room's shadows, Peregrine's hand rested on the obsidian armrest. The crimson crest on his wrist pulsed faintly, responding to ancient magic woven into the throne itself. And somewhere in the darkness, history prepared to repeat. 6 months passed like a carefully constructed lie. The kingdom healed its visible wounds, while invisible ones festered beneath silk and ceremony. Peregrine Fiorentino became what he'd been born to be. A prince who commanded respect, whose tactical mind shaped military policy, whose presence at court carried weight that servants could never possess. He wore his restored title like armor that fit better each day. River learned to navigate nobility's treacherous waters, though she still felt like an imposter at every formal dinner. She'd memorized which fork to use, which courtesies to offer, how to smile while feeling nothing. But late at night, alone in chambers too large and too cold, she remembered what it felt like to be invisible. Sometimes she missed it. Caden trained in the mornings with his father, learning blade work and strategy. In the afternoons, Lord Lavinia himself taught the boy about magical defenses and the weight of leadership. The child was being shaped by two men who were teaching him to survive in a world where loyalty might soon become a choice rather than a certainty. The banquet, celebrating the kingdom's recovery, filled the great hall with light and laughter that felt almost genuine. Nobles raised crystal goblets filled with wine that cost more than most families earned in a year. They toasted to peace, to victory, to the alliance that had saved them all. "To Lord Lavinia Fiorentino," a duke called out, his voice carrying above the din. "The king whose wisdom preserved our kingdom." Applause rippled through the crowd like a wave breaking against stone. Peregrine stood slowly, his crimson and silver robes catching candlelight. All eyes turned to him. "To Lord Lavinia Fiorentino," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "The king who showed mercy when he could have shown steel. Who chose trust over suspicion. Who gave a broken man back his name." The hall erupted in approval. Glasses clinked. Voices rose in agreement. But as Peregrine sat, his eyes lingered on the throne where Lavinia sat, that obsidian seat that had been carved for Fiorentino kings centuries before either of them had drawn breath. The crimson crest on his wrist pulsed faintly, visible only to those who knew to look for it. River saw it. Her chest tightened with dread she couldn't name. Later, in their chambers, she found him standing at the window, staring toward the throne room visible across the courtyard. Moonlight painted him in shades of silver and shadow. "Peregrine," she said softly, "what are you thinking about?" "Justice." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. River moved closer, choosing her words carefully. "We have justice. Mason is dead. Your name is restored. Our son is safe." He turned to her, and there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before, something that looked like hunger, wearing the mask of righteousness. "Do we?" "My parents died in exile for a crime they didn't commit. I spent 20 years scrubbing floors and keeping my head down while Lavinia sat on a throne that—" He stopped himself, jaw clenching. "While Lavinia what?" River's heart was pounding now. "Peregrine, finish that sentence." Silence stretched between them like a chasm opening. The door burst open. Caden ran in, breathless from some childhood adventure. "Papa, Lord Lavinia asked if we want to join him for morning training tomorrow. He said he wants to teach me about the old defensive wards." Peregrine's expression shifted so quickly River almost missed it, calculation replacing whatever darkness had been there a moment before. His smile looked genuine, practiced, perfect. "Tell Lord Lavinia yes. We'd be honored." Caden beamed and ran off to deliver the message. The mask slipped the moment the boy was gone. River grabbed Peregrine's arm, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to protect my family. That's all I've ever done." "By doing what?" No answer. Just silence that felt like betrayal forming in real time. Near midnight, Peregrine walked alone through corridors that had learned his footsteps. Guards nodded as he passed, not with the dismissal they'd shown the butler, but with the respect due to royalty. He'd earned that, bled for it, killed for it. He stopped outside the throne room. The door stood open, moonlight streaming through windows to illuminate that obsidian seat that had haunted his dreams for 20 years. He stepped inside. The throne room was empty, silent except for his breathing. Peregrine moved forward slowly, like a man approaching something holy or something forbidden. Perhaps both. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, and touched the armrest. The crimson crest on his wrist exploded with light. The castle's ancient magic responded, recognizing royal blood, calling to something primal and powerful buried in his bones. The throne itself seemed to pulse with approval. "It could have been mine," Peregrine whispered to the empty room. "Should have been mine." "Could have been?" Lavinia's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Or should have been?" Peregrine spun. The vampire king stood in the doorway, moonlight painting him in silver and shadow. His crimson eyes held no surprise, only a terrible, weary certainty. Their gazes locked. The air between them crackled with unspoken accusations. "I haven't decided yet," Peregrine said finally, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. Lavinia's hand moved to his sword hilt, not threatening, not yet, but the promise of what could come. "When you do decide, let me know. I prefer my enemies honest." "We're not enemies." "Not yet." Lavinia's voice was soft, sad, and absolutely certain. But Mason was right about one thing. History always repeats. One throne, two claimants, two men with the crest. He paused. Only one of us will be standing when this ends. They faced each other in that throne room. Two men who'd fought side by side, who'd saved each other's lives, who wore the same mark of royalty and carried the same capacity for both honor and ambition. The moment stretched. Broke. Lavinia turned and left without another word. Peregrine stood alone, his hand still resting on the throne, the crimson crest still burning on his wrist. In their chambers, River held Caden while he slept, tears streaming silently down her face. She knew what was coming, felt it in her bones the way animals sense storms before they break. She would have to choose, husband or king, love or loyalty, the man who'd given her a family or the man who'd given that family safety. And she didn't know which choice would destroy her more. The throne room stood empty now, but the obsidian seat glowed faintly. The crimson crest carved into its back pulsed with ancient magic that had witnessed centuries of Fiorentino ambition, betrayal, and blood. Across the castle, in separate chambers, two men stared at the same moon through different windows. Both wore the mark of royalty. Both had their hands resting on sword hilts. Both were preparing for a war neither wanted, and both knew was inevitable. Some friendships are forged in fire. Others are shattered by crowns. And in the Fiorentino dynasty, the line between ally and enemy was always written in blood. The moon set. Dawn approached. And somewhere in the darkness between night and morning, history prepared to repeat itself one final, terrible time. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Your time, your attention, and your support truly mean the world to me. I appreciate every single one of you. Now tell me, what do you think happens next in this story? Drop your predictions in the comments. You never know, the next twist might come from your idea. And before you go, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more amazing stories. Let me know where in the world you're watching from too. I love seeing how far this family reaches. Once again, thank you. You're the real reason these stories keep coming to life.